Thank you, Liz, and thank you for the invitation. This, believe it or not, kind of takes me back to my roots in terms of my graduate school training. But I'm a trade economist, and I mainly work on agricultural trade issues. And in fact, one of my visions for this Blasingame Chair of Excellence is what I hold in the Agricultural and Resource Economics Department is to establish an infrastructure and program within the Institute of Agriculture focused on providing information and research that helps to better market Tennessee agricultural and food products in foreign markets. Right? That's what I work on now. But this actually takes me back to my roots where my dissertation was actually on the impacts of the World Trade Organization. So it's 20 years ago. On U.S. dairy exports. In fact, it was funded by National Milk and U.S. Dairy Export Council. So that's one benefit, and I'm glad I was invited for that. The second reason is that if you have never had the experience of trying to translate legal farm bill language into a presentation for non-lawyers, we all need that experience. And I'm telling you, I thank you just for that alone. Having to do it once or twice is enough for a lifetime. But then the last thing I want to say is that what I want to do is really compare the last farm bill with this farm bill, and in between that, the Bipartisan Budget Act, which really is, to a certain degree, as it relates to at least the margin protection program, which is sort of a continuation. And so really, there are only going to be three things that I'm going to talk about, right? I'm going to give some background. And one of the things I know is in terms of the production base that's registered with FSA, it's pretty clear quite a few producers in the state already participate in the margin protection program for dairy. And so a lot of this may come across as just background that you're familiar with, but I just want to say a few things for those in the room with zero background in terms of the Farm Bill and as it relates to dairy over both the last Farm Bill and the one even prior. I do want to say a little bit about the 2018 Bipartisan Budget Act, because that was the first step in modifying this margin protection program for dairy in a way that could benefit producers more in terms of lower premium costs. And then this new Farm Bill, which goes even beyond that, sort of extending the coverage. All right, and throughout the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about implications. And I have no problem with you stopping me during the presentation with any questions if you need something to be cleared up or if you have some issue like addressed. All right. And so the root of this program is obviously based on two things, sort of the high variability in dairy prices and milk prices, as well as the variability in feed costs. And it was in 2008 that that we first sort of thought about covering margins as opposed to a basic price support like a loan program. And so, and the whole notion is not only should we ensure sort of a minimum price for dairy producers, but obviously a minimum revenue. One of the earlier programs, this gross margin program, had limited participation. And so we really didn't get a program with expanded participation until the 2014 Farm Bill, which is what we which implemented the margin protection program for dairy. And then from that, many of you know there's been a new name change, and that's what we'll talk about now. But what do we mean when we refer to margins, right? Margins in the context of this particular program. And this is how FSA calculates the margins for a particular period in terms of triggering a payment in this program. And I'll talk a little bit about how all of that works out. But here's what we mean when we say margin, right? Some representative milk price minus feed costs based on this formulation from FSA and given sort of the prices of corn, soybean meal, alfalfa hay, and then this difference is the actual margin that's put out by FSA, all right? And as many of you know, within this program, you could ensure a certain margin value. And if this actual value falls below that, you receive a payment for the difference, right? And so, but the thing is, in order to ensure or cover a particular margin, right, you obviously have to pay for it. Now, the most basic level in the 2014 Farm Bill was $4, which you'd call sort of catastrophic coverage, right? And then that only came with a registration fee of about $100. But as you increased in terms of the margin, the amount of the margin that you wanted coverage for based on the sort of base production that you had registered with FSA, obviously there was increasing cost per hundredweight insured, right? This was divided up into tiers, right? That production below 4 million pounds had a lower coverage than production in excess, meaning lower premiums rather than production in excess of 4 million pounds. All right. And so here's the data from SSA on the pounds of milk in Tennessee registered under the Margin Protection Program since the implementation of the Farm Bill in 2014. Or at least from what I could tell from the data, that's about 250 out of 370 dairy operations. But the real issue is, what does this mean in the context of the pounds of milk registered in this program nationally? All right, this is how we compare, right, to larger dairy producing states, right, compared to, say, California and Wisconsin. All right, so the question is, how often has this program sort of actually led to payments for dairy producers, right? So how often has FSA and the government had to actually pay producers? And that's a function of how often has this margin actually fallen below the coverage levels, right? And what you could see is if you just simply registered, right, and didn't pay for anything other than the registration fee and had the catastrophic coverage at $4, it's only during 2 periods where you would have actually triggered a payment, right? But then you could even see that if you got the maximum coverage at an $8 margin, there are certain periods when a payment would be triggered, but the actual calculated margin, particularly since the implementation of the Farm Bill, has been quite high. And you could see since 14 above that level. Now, and that's actually very important because, and I'll talk about this a little later, is that within the new Farm Bill, that the amount that you actually paid into the program in terms of the premiums you paid over that time period, minus whatever payments you've received, you actually get that difference back as a payment under the new Farm Bill, right? And that payment can be applied either to new premiums or as a cash payment to the producer. And so just in this most, so this would be the last year before the Bipartisan Budget Act, right? And as many of you know, these payments before the Bipartisan Budget Act were actually triggered every 2 months, right? So you had like sort of 6 opportunities to be paid through this program, which has now been changed to monthly. But here's the thing to note. Oh, okay. I thought I did something. Here's the thing to note, that at least within the last year, well, the last year before the Bipartisan Budget Act, sort of not a single period did the margin sort of drop below the maximum coverage, right? So no payments were triggered. So let's go ahead and now kind of pivot to the Bipartisan Budget Act, which was passed earlier in 2018, which was really sort of the precursor to the current Farm Bill. All right, so what are some of the main differences that if you compare the 2014 Farm Bill to the Bipartisan Budget Act? So one, obviously, the chance to enroll again, right? But this change from these sort of 2-month payments to this 1-month payment. And why is that important, right? Because you can imagine a 2 months time period where the average margin was clearly above the coverage level, but 1 month was below and 1 month was above, right? And in the case of monthly payments, obviously, you would have gotten a payment at least in the month where it was below. All right. There was some waiving of the administrative fee, but that wasn't that big of a deal. But the bigger deal was the increase in the amount that could be covered under at least the tier 1 plan, right? That you didn't go over into the sort of tier 2, which is much more expensive coverage, until 5 million pounds. And that's been carried forward to this current farm bill. All right. Now, another thing about the Bipartisan Budget Act that was pretty good was the fact that the premiums on average got reduced by about 75%. All right. And so you could see sort of in terms of the farm bill, the 2014 farm bill, for instance, maximum coverage was at about 47.5 cents per cut weight, whereas under the Bipartisan Budget Act, that was only about 14 cents. And so you got significant reductions. All right, and the other thing to note is that at least within 2018, all right, now we're talking about monthly payments. So unlike the previous slide where there were sort of 6 payments per year, that you do have quite a few periods where at least a margin payment was triggered if you got the maximum coverage. All right, so like with anything, I think one of the issues with this program is the fact that payments aren't triggered that often. But even with the changes to the margin protection program under the Bipartisan Budget Act, even if you carry that back, it wouldn't have been that much more revenue for dairy producers. All right, so now let's go into sort of what's in the new farm bill. And what the Farm Bill does is actually continue what took place in the Bipartisan Budget Act, but there are a few other additions. All right, so these are the margin, the premiums for the margin that you want covered for a particular base. All right, and so this is for sort of the catastrophic coverage where you don't pay anything, and this black line represents the cost as you increase coverage in the 2014 Farm Bill, right? And so one of the things to note is in the 2014 Farm Bill, maximum coverage was $8, and to get that, you had to pay 47.5 cents per cut weight. But this new current Farm Bill extends that out to $9.50 in terms of the margin that you can insure, and the cost of that is at a maximum of 15 cents per cut weight. All right, and so what you see is that margins have been sort of significantly reduced compared to before, which carries sort of forward the spirit of the Bipartisan Budget Act, but then at the same time, the coverage has been expanded to ensure a much larger margin than before. All right, and then once again, as a carryover from the Bipartisan Budget Act, Tier 1 coverage is 5 million pounds or less. Now, what's different, however, is to ensure a margin for production in excess of these 5 million pounds is actually more expensive than the last Farm Bill. All right. And we're talking about at higher coverage levels. It's about the same up until 550. All right, so, well, what does this mean? All right, so if we just think about the current Farm Bill and we sort of think about this looking backwards, that obviously this difference between 8 and 950 would have triggered quite a few more payments than we would otherwise have gotten the previous years under the previous Farm Bill. So once again, this is 2018, and you could see sort of going back to what I already showed, with the maximum coverage, every single month would have triggered a payment, right, at $9.50. So let's just kind of wrap up. I didn't, because I want to save some time for questions just in case you have a few questions. All right, so one of the things, obviously, the biggest, well, not the biggest change, but this is a change in, right, sort of the dairy margin coverage program versus the margin protection program in place until 2023. Obviously, as we talked about, it expands the maximum margin to be covered. It lowers premiums significantly. But here's something that's even particularly important for large-scale producers, that now the minimum coverage of base, let's see, could be as low as 5%, all right? So you could cover as little as 5%. And there's a reason that's important, because for some large-scale producers, 25% of base production actually exceeded the tier 1 sort of coverage level. So this allows for larger producers to at least ensure at the tier 1 level, and you could go as high as 95% of your base production, which is different than before, all right? And these are sort of increased in 5% increments. All right. Now, if you sign up for the entire 5-year life of the Farm Bill, you actually do get a 25% discount in the premiums that you pay. I'm not quite sure why this was necessarily put in. Some of you may know whether or not multi-producing dairies having problems with previous signups in the old Farm Bill, but apparently they tried to address that by having each dairy count as sort of a single operation. I think only one owner needs to sign up, but there's a way to trigger payments for all owners. Now, one of the things with the previous Farm Bill is you needed a production history to establish your base production upon which your insurance would be based and which your payments would be based. So even if you do not have a production history, under this Farm Bill, there are ways to establish that production base with limited history. All right. There's some language in there to say that established producers can't sort of dissolve and then reestablish themselves for this purpose. But if you are legitimately a new operation without a 3-year production history, you can still participate in this program. Now, one of the things about, obviously, this program is it's based on feed costs. And so Congress was particularly concerned with sort of the way in which the feed cost component of the margin was being addressed and calculated. And so so the secretary has been tasked with providing a series of reports on each of the components of feed costs. And that's just to justify sort of the feed cost component of the margin. Now, if you were in some way excluded, that there's a way to participate retroactively. Now, whether that triggers a historical payment that comes to you now, I wasn't quite clear in reading the language, but I'm assuming that's the case, right? So if you, for any reason, were excluded from this program, particularly because you participated, say, in the other margin protection program, you can actually go back and participate, and I think you receive a payment. That I'm not sure. Someone in the room may be able to clear that point up. And here's the point I wanted to make, that one of the provisions in the current Farm Bill is that if you paid more premiums than you received in payments, you get that difference back as either a cash rebate or you could apply it to premiums in 2018 or the future. All right. Now, and if you apply it to future premiums, you're going to get 75% of that payment back. But if you just simply want it taken as cash, they'll give you half back. You actually do have to register for that, though. So that's not something automatic. You actually do have to register. And then lastly, the Farm Bill does redefine sort of the all milk price being used to calculate the margins, and how Class 1 price move is being defined as this sort of Class 3, Class 4 price average plus 74 cents per cut weight. Okay. All right, so lastly, I want to just sort of conclude with some implications, right? I think one of the message from this Farm Bill is the fact that you could say Washington heard the concerns of the U.S. dairy sector, right? Because the goal was obviously, one, to make this program cheaper, to expand the coverage, and to more likely than not ensure payments to dairy producers during periods when margins decline, all right? So you have those two things. So much more likely to trigger payments and to get the maximum coverage is relatively cheaper, obviously, than in previous years. Now, mind you, some studies are saying this benefits small and mid-sized dairies more than large-sized dairies, and I spoke about that just a bit. But the point is that it depends on how you're defining benefits of this program. But small and mid-sized dairies tend to benefit. But one of the questions being raised, and I know this isn't a question for this group, but this is usually a question for economists, is sort of, is the program now too generous? Obviously, as a receiver of government payments and a participant in the government program, rarely do we think about programs being too generous. But the question is about the efficiency and how resources are being allocated. And is this program now sort of the type of program that would sort of lead to, say, the willingness of a financially distressed dairy to sort of stay in place because of the program and not because it's economically feasible? But with that, I'll close and just say, I think given what's been taking place, particularly in the Tennessee dairy sector, as well as the U.S. dairy sector, that the goal of both the Bipartisan Budget Act and this particular farm bill is to ensure the economic viability of dairy farms in this country and the state. And that's pretty evident by sort of how this program has been restructured. So with that, I thank you. I look forward to questions. I usually have a thank you slide with my information, but I have some cards in the back, and particularly those of you interested in trade issues, but as well as farm bill issues. I'll stick around a little bit. I know you all have a business meeting coming up, and I don't necessarily want to interfere with that. So with that, thank you. I appreciate the invitation, and I look forward to your questions.